They told her Americans would do unspeakable things to capture Japanese women, that soldiers would tear away what little dignity remained after defeat. So when 23-year-old Yuki Tanaka was pulled from the rubble of Okinawa in June 1945, her first instinct was to cover herself with her torn kimono, her hands trembling as she tried to make herself invisible. She waited for the violence she had been promised, but when the American nurse approached, she did not rip the fabric away. Instead, she wrapped a clean wool blanket around Yuki's shaking shoulders and said 2 words in broken Japanese that would haunt Yuki for the rest of her life. "You safe." It was not cruelty that broke Yuki that day. It was unexpected mercy. And if you stay with this story, you'll discover why sometimes kindness is harder to survive than hatred. But before we continue, if you appreciate these forgotten stories from history, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. These stories deserve to be remembered. The cave had been home for 6 weeks. Not home exactly, but shelter. A place to hide from the American artillery that pounded the island day and night. Yuki had learned to measure time not by days, but by the gaps between explosions. Long silence meant danger. It meant the Americans were advancing on foot. Short rhythmic blasts meant the big guns were still firing, and paradoxically, that meant she was still safe in her hole. She shared the cave with 7 others. Mrs. Nakamura, who was 60 and had stopped speaking 3 weeks ago. 2 teenage sisters whose names Yuki never learned because they only whispered to each other. A young mother clutching an infant who no longer cried, which was somehow worse than crying. An old man who insisted he had been a teacher before the war, though Yuki suspected he was confused about many things now. And Kenji, a boy of perhaps 14 who had lost his entire family in the first week of the American invasion. Yuki had been a seamstress before the war came to Okinawa. She had worked in a small shop in Naha, creating beautiful kimonos with careful stitches and traditional patterns. She took pride in her work, in making something lovely in a world that often felt harsh. When the warnings came, when they said the Americans were landing, that everyone must evacuate or fight, she had not believed it would be so bad. Okinawa was small, after all. Surely the fighting would be brief. She had been wrong. The fighting was not brief. It was total. It swallowed the island whole, transforming rice fields into moonscapes and villages into ash. Her shop burned in the first week. Her parents died in the second, caught in artillery fire, while trying to reach the Japanese military headquarters to volunteer for civilian defense. Yuki only survived because she ran the other direction. Now she lived in a cave with strangers, eating grass and roots when they could find them, drinking rainwater collected in empty artillery shells. Her kimono, once beautiful green silk with crane patterns, was torn and filthy. Her hands, which had created such delicate stitching, were covered in cuts and dirt. She had lost weight until her bones showed through her skin. But she was alive. Somehow, despite everything, she was alive. The morning the cave fell was bright and hot. Yuki remembered that detail because it seemed wrong somehow. Catastrophe should come with storms and darkness, not sunlight. She had been sleeping or trying to sleep when Kenji shook her shoulder. His eyes were wide with terror. She heard it then. Voices. English voices. Close. Too close. The others heard it too. Mrs. Nakamura, who had not spoken in weeks, began to whimper. The young mother clutched her silent baby tighter. The teenage sisters held hands so hard their knuckles went white. The old teacher muttered prayers to ancestors. They all knew what this meant. The Americans had found them. Yuki had been taught what Americans did to capture Japanese women. The military officers who came through the caves in the early days had been very clear about this. They said American soldiers were animals who respected nothing, who violated women and murdered children. They said death was preferable to capture. Some officers had even distributed grenades to civilians, encouraging them to choose honorable death over shameful captivity. Yuki had not taken a grenade. She wanted to live. Even in the cave, even starving, even terrified, some stubborn part of her wanted to see another sunrise. But now, hearing the American voices, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. The voice came in Japanese, heavily accented but understandable. A loudspeaker crackled outside the cave entrance. "Come out. We will not hurt you. Come out. You will receive food and medical care. Come out. We will not hurt you." The message repeated, mechanical and strange. No one moved. Mrs. Nakamura's whimpers grew louder. The old teacher shook his head violently, muttering about tricks and demons. Yuki felt her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. The voice was lying. It had to be lying. Everyone knew Americans were cruel. Everyone knew what they did. Then smoke began to pour into the cave. Not regular smoke. Something chemical, choking, burning their eyes and throats. Tear gas, though Yuki did not know the term. She only knew she could not breathe, could not see, could not think. The others were coughing, gasping, stumbling toward the entrance because there was nowhere else to go. Yuki emerged into blinding sunlight, hands over her face, trying desperately to cover herself with the torn edges of her kimono. This was it. This was when the violence would start. She heard boots on stone, saw shadows moving, felt rough hands grab her arms. She tried to scream, but her throat was too raw from the gas. She tried to fight, but she had no strength left. She waited for pain, for violation, for the end. But the hands that held her were not cruel. They guided rather than dragged. A canteen appeared at her lips, water, clean water, cool against her burning throat. Someone was speaking in English, then in broken Japanese. Okay. You okay? Safe? You safe? The words made no sense. She opened her eyes, still watering from the gas, and saw American soldiers. Big men in green uniforms with strange helmets and weapons. She flinched, trying to make herself smaller, covering her body with her hands because her kimono was so torn it revealed too much. Then she saw the woman. An American woman in uniform, but different from the soldiers. Her uniform was white and clean with a red cross on the sleeve. A nurse. The woman was shorter than the man, with brown hair tied back and a face that looked tired, but not cruel. She approached Yuki slowly, hands visible, speaking in that same broken Japanese. My name, Lieutenant Sarah. Nurse. I help. You safe? Yuki did. Not believe her. Could not believe her. She backed away or tried to, but her legs would not hold her. She collapsed onto the rocky ground, hands still clutching at her torn clothing, trying to preserve some dignity, some protection. She waited for the Sarah to rip the fabric away, to laugh, to hurt her. That was what enemies did. That was what she had been told to expect. Instead, Sarah knelt down slowly, moving like someone approaching a frightened animal. From her medical bag, she pulled out a thick wool blanket. Olive green, clean, heavy. She unfolded it carefully and then, with movements so gentle Yuki almost could not process them, wrapped the blanket around Yuki's shoulders, covering her torn kimono, covering her shame, covering her fear. You safe, Sarah said again, adjusting the blanket so it covered Yuki completely. I promise. You safe now. Yuki did not understand. This made no sense. Enemies did not give blankets. Enemies did not speak softly. Enemies did not promise safety. She began to cry, not from pain, but from confusion, from exhaustion, from the impossible contradiction of kindness from someone she had been taught to fear more than death itself. They took the cave survivors to a field hospital, which was really just a collection of large tents set up near what used to be a school. Yuki walked in a daze, wrapped in the blanket Sarah had given her, flanked by American soldiers who did not touch her, did not threaten her, just walked alongside as if they were merely escorts rather than captors. The smell hit her first, not blood or death as she expected, but antiseptic. Clean. Medical. Strange chemical smells that burned her nose, but in a way that suggested cleanliness rather than danger. Inside the tent, more nurses moved between cots where injured people lay. Japanese people, civilians like herself. Some soldiers too, though their uniforms had been removed and replaced with simple gowns. Sarah guided Yuki to a cot and gestured for her to sit. Yuki obeyed because she did not know what else to do. Her mind felt disconnected from her body, as if she were watching all of this happen to someone else. Sarah began examining her with careful, professional movements. She checked Yuki's eyes, her throat, her breathing. She looked at the cuts on Yuki's hands and feet, making soft, sympathetic sounds. Okay, Sarah said, mixing English and Japanese words. I clean. Medicine. No hurt, okay? She held up bandages and bottles of clear liquid so Yuki could see them, as if understanding that trust had to be built through transparency. Yuki nodded, still clutching the blanket around herself, still waiting for the moment when this strange kindness would end and the real cruelty would begin. The cleaning hurt. Yuki had expected that. When Sarah dabbed antiseptic on the cuts, it burned and Yuki gasped. But Sarah stopped immediately, her face showing concern. Sorry, she said. Sorry, must clean. Infection bad. But sorry hurt. She waited until Yuki nodded before continuing, working more gently, talking in a steady stream of mixed English and Japanese that Yuki only half understood but found strangely comforting. Other nurses moved through the tent, all women, all wearing the same white uniforms with red crosses. They treated the other cave survivors with the same careful gentleness. Yuki watched as they gave Mrs. Nakamura water and bread, coaxing the old woman to drink. She watched them examine the young mother's baby. The infant was alive, barely, just sleeping from exhaustion and hunger. The nurses set up an intravenous drip, explaining in simple Japanese that the baby needed fluids and sugar. Kenji, the teenage boy, sat on a nearby cot looking stunned. A male medic was bandaging a wound on his leg, speaking to him in English while another soldier attempted to translate. Kenji kept glancing at Yuki as if seeking confirmation that this was real, that they were truly being helped rather than hurt. Yuki had no answers to give him. She was as confused as he was. When Sarah finished bandaging Yuki's cuts, she held up a syringe. Yuki flinched backward, eyes wide. A needle. They were going to inject her with something. This was it. This was the poison, the drug, the thing that would finally reveal their true intentions. She tried to scramble away but had nowhere to go. Sarah quickly set the syringe down, hands raised in a peaceful gesture. No, no. she said urgently. Medicine. Good. For infection. Look. She picked up a card with pictures on it, diagrams showing how vaccines worked, how medicine prevented disease. She pointed to her own arm, where a small scar showed she had received the same injection. Everyone get. American soldiers get. I get. You get. Safe. Make strong. No sick. Yuki stared at the card, trying to process this. They were vaccinating prisoners, giving them the same medicine they gave their own soldiers? It made no sense. Why waste valuable medicine on enemies? Why care if prisoners got sick? Unless they really did not plan to kill them, unless they really did plan to keep them alive. Slowly, Yuki extended her arm. Sarah smiled, actually smiled, warm and genuine, and administered the injection with practiced ease. It hurt less than the antiseptic had. When it was done, Sarah placed a small bandage over the injection site and patted Yuki's shoulder gently. Good, she said. Very brave. Now rest. An hour later, maybe two, Yuki had lost her ability to track time. Soldiers arrived with metal trays of food. Real food. Not grass or roots or the moldy rice they had been surviving on in the cave. Yuki stared at her tray in disbelief. White bread, soft and fresh. A piece of chicken, actual meat, cooked and still warm. Canned vegetables, green beans and carrots. A cup of soup that smelled of salt and herbs. An orange, bright and impossible. And a small square of chocolate wrapped in foil. Yuki looked around the tent. Every survivor from the cave had received the same tray. The teenage sisters were staring at their food with wide eyes, afraid to touch it. Mrs. Nakamura was already eating, her earlier silence forgotten as she devoured the bread with trembling hands. The old teacher was crying while he ate, tears streaming down his face into his soup. Kenji caught Yuki's eye. Is it poisoned? He whispered in Japanese. It was a fair question. Yuki did not know. But she was so hungry. 6 weeks of near starvation had made her body desperate, and the Americans were eating the same food. She could see soldiers at a nearby table with identical trays. I don't think so, Yuki whispered back. She picked up the bread first. It was soft in her hands, so different from the hard, moldy pieces they had been choking down in the cave. She took a small bite. The taste exploded in her mouth. Wheat, salt, butter, real bread. She had forgotten bread could taste like this. She began to cry. Around her, other prisoners were having the same reaction. Tears flowed freely as they ate. Not tears of sadness exactly, but tears of confusion, of relief, of the overwhelming sensation of being fed when you expected to be starved, of being treated like a human being when you expected to be treated like an animal. Yuki ate slowly, savoring every bite because she did not know when food would come again. The chicken was tender, seasoned with salt and pepper. The vegetables were soft and buttery. The soup warmed her from the inside out. And the orange. When she peeled it, the citrus smell made her think of childhood, of festivals before the war, of a world that no longer existed. She saved the chocolate for last, unwrapping it carefully. It was dark and sweet and rich, melting on her tongue. She closed her eyes, trying to memorize the taste, because surely this could not last. Surely tomorrow they would stop feeding her. Surely this was temporary, a trick, a strange aberration before the real punishment began. But Sarah, making rounds through the tent, stopped at Yuki's cot and smiled. Good? She asked, gesturing to the empty tray. Yuki nodded, unable to speak. Tomorrow more, Sarah said, her broken Japanese somehow beautiful in its simplicity. Everyday food, you eat, get strong, okay? Yuki nodded again, still not quite believing, still waiting for the other shoe to drop. After the meal, the nurses brought clean clothes, simple cotton dresses for the women, loose pants and shirts for the men and boys. They were plain, utilitarian, probably military surplus, but they were clean. Yuki held the dress in her hands, feeling the fabric. It was rough cotton, nothing like the silk kimonos she used to sew, but it was whole. No tears, no stains, no smell of cave and fear and death. Sarah led Yuki to a curtained area where she could change in privacy. Privacy. They were giving her privacy. Yuki undressed slowly, removing her ruined kimono for the last time. She looked at it for a moment, the green silk now brown with dirt and blood, the crane pattern barely visible under months of filth. This kimono had been a gift from her mother. She had worn it the day the Americans invaded. It had survived everything she had survived. She folded it carefully and set it aside. Then she pulled on the cotton dress. It was too big, hanging loose on her thin frame, but it was clean. And that was worth more than she could express. When she emerged from behind the curtain, Sarah was waiting with a hairbrush. A hairbrush. Such a simple, ordinary thing. But Yuki's hair had been tangled and filthy for weeks, and the sight of the brush made her want to cry again. Sarah gestured to a stool and Yuki sat. The nurse began to brush her hair, gently working out the tangles, careful not to pull too hard. She hummed while she worked, an American tune Yuki did not recognize. It was such an intimate act, brushing someone's hair, something a mother would do, or a sister, or a friend. Not something an enemy would do, not something a conqueror would do to the conquered. When Sarah finished, she handed Yuki a small mirror. Yuki almost did not recognize herself. She was painfully thin, her cheekbones too prominent, her eyes too large in her face. But her hair was brushed and clean. Her skin, washed earlier, was no longer gray with dirt. She wore a clean dress. She looked human again. She looked like a person rather than a creature from the caves. That evening, they were moved to a civilian detention camp just outside what remained of Naha. It was a collection of tents and some repaired buildings, surrounded by fences, but not the threatening barbed wire Yuki had expected. Guard towers stood at corners, but the guards did not point their weapons at the prisoners. They just stood there, watchful but not aggressive. Inside, Yuki was assigned to a tent with 15 other women. Each had a cot, a real cot with a thin mattress, and 2 blankets. The blanket Sarah had given Yuki earlier was one of them. Yuki spread them on her cot, running her hands over the rough wool. She had not slept on anything soft in 6 weeks. She had not felt safe enough to truly sleep in longer than that. That night, lying on her cot wrapped in American blankets, fed with American food, wearing American clothes, Yuki did not sleep despite her exhaustion. She stared at the tent ceiling, listening to the other women breathing around her. Some cried softly, some prayed. Some, like Mrs. Nakamura, snored in the deep sleep of the truly exhausted. Yuki could not reconcile what she had been told with what she was experiencing. The Americans were supposed to be monsters. They were supposed to be cruel, violent, inhuman. But they had given her food, medicine, clean clothes, and shelter. They had treated her wounds and brushed her hair. They had shown her more kindness in one day than she had experienced in 6 weeks of hiding with her own people. It made no sense, and yet it was happening. And Yuki did not know what to do with this knowledge. The days developed a rhythm. Yuki woke to a bell each morning, not harsh or militaristic, just a simple bell to signal breakfast. The women would line up outside the mess tent with metal plates and cups. Servers, sometimes American soldiers, sometimes Japanese prisoners assigned to kitchen duty, would ladle out oatmeal or rice porridge, eggs when available, always bread and jam, and coffee or tea. The food was plain but adequate, more than adequate, actually. Yuki found herself gaining weight, her face filling out, her strength returning. After 6 weeks of starvation, even simple food felt like luxury. The coffee was particularly strange, bitter and strong, nothing like the tea she was used to. But it became something she looked forward to, something that marked the beginning of each day. After breakfast came work assignments. The Americans believed in keeping prisoners occupied, but the work was not punishing. Yuki was assigned to a sewing detail along with other women who had experience with textiles. They were given damaged uniforms and tents to repair, provided with needles and thread, and allowed to work in the shade of a large tent while guards watched from a distance. It was familiar work. Yuki's hands, which had been so damaged in the cave, began to remember their old skills. The repetitive motion of needle through fabric was soothing, almost meditative. She worked alongside other women, mostly in silence at first, but gradually conversation emerged. Quiet conversations about what they had lost, where they had been, who they were looking for. One woman, Hana, had been a schoolteacher before the invasion. She was perhaps 40, dignified even in prison clothes, with gray streaking her black hair. She sat next to Yuki at the sewing detail and spoke in a low voice while they worked. "My husband was a soldier," she said, not looking up from her stitching. "He died in the first week. My children—" She paused, swallowing hard. "I do not know where my children are. They were evacuated to the north. I have heard nothing." Yuki wanted to offer comfort but had none to give. "My parents are gone too," she said quietly. "And my shop. Everything is gone." The women stitched in silence for a while after that, needles flashing in the filtered sunlight, united in loss. Lunch arrived at midday. Rice with vegetables, sometimes fish, sometimes canned meat. The portions were reasonable, not generous, but enough. Yuki never left a meal hungry, which was a strange new feeling. After lunch came a rest period during the hottest part of the day, then more work in the afternoon, followed by dinner at sunset. Evenings were the strangest time. The prisoners were left largely alone. Guards remained at the perimeter but did not interfere with conversations or gatherings. Some prisoners organized prayer sessions, quietly chanting Buddhist sutras or Christian prayers. Others played simple games with stones and sticks, trying to recreate Go or Shogi from memory. Some just sat and stared at nothing, lost in their own thoughts. Yuki usually spent evenings sitting with her tent mates, listening to their stories. There was Michiko, a farmer's wife who had survived by hiding in a destroyed barn. There was Ayumi, barely 16, who had become separated from her family during the evacuation and did not know if they lived. There was old Mrs. Nakamura, who had finally begun speaking again, though she only talked about the past, about her youth, about Okinawa before the war, as if the present were too terrible to acknowledge. The contradiction gnawed at Yuki. Every day she expected conditions to worsen. Every day she waited for the cruelty to begin. But every day she was fed, allowed to work, left in peace. Every day the Americans proved her expectations wrong. It was disorienting, like walking on ground that kept shifting beneath her feet. 3 weeks into her captivity, Yuki received a letter. It arrived with a batch of mail the Americans had organized, allowing the Red Cross to facilitate communication between prisoners and surviving family members in other parts of Okinawa or Japan proper. A young American lieutenant working with a Japanese translator called Yuki's name from a list. Her hands shook as she took the thin envelope. The handwriting was familiar, her aunt's, from the mainland. Her aunt had been living in Hiroshima before the war. Yuki opened it carefully, afraid of what it might contain. The letter was brief, written in a cramped hand that suggested paper shortage. Yuki, I heard you survived. I thank the ancestors. Life here is very difficult. Food is scarce. The cities are destroyed. We live in constant fear of air raids. Many have died, but we survive. We endure. Stay strong. Your aunt, Fumiko. Yuki read the letter 3 times, trying to read between the lines. Food is scarce. That meant they were starving. Many have died. That could mean her cousins, her uncle, anyone. We live in constant fear. The war continued for them while she sat in a prison camp being fed 3 meals a day. That evening at dinner, Yuki stared at her plate. Rice, fish, pickled vegetables, miso soup, bread. A full meal. More food than her aunt had probably seen in weeks. Guilt rose in her throat, thick and choking. She pushed the plate away, unable to eat. Hana, sitting beside her, noticed. What's wrong? She asked quietly. Yuki showed her the letter. Hana read it and nodded slowly. I received one too, she said. From my sister in Tokyo. It is the same story. They starve while we are fed. They suffer while we are safe. She paused, looking at her own plate. It is a strange kind of torture, is it not? To survive while those we love suffer? Yuki nodded, unable to speak. That was exactly it. The Americans were not torturing her with cruelty. They were torturing her with kindness, because every meal, every blanket, every moment of safety was a reminder that she had it better than her own people, that she, a prisoner, was more comfortable than Japanese civilians still fighting. The contradiction was unbearable. She looked around the mess tent. Hundreds of Japanese prisoners eating American food. Children who had been skeletal now showing color in their cheeks. Old people who had been dying now sitting upright. Everyone was getting healthier. Everyone was being fed. And somewhere beyond the fences, Japan was burning. Japanese children were starving. Japanese cities were being reduced to ash. The Americans were destroying Japan while feeding Japanese prisoners. How could both things be true? That night, Yuki could not sleep. She lay on her cot, wrapped in her American blanket, staring at the tent ceiling. The irony was crushing. She had expected to be murdered in captivity. Instead, she had been saved. She had expected cruelty. Instead, she had received mercy. And somehow, that mercy felt heavier than cruelty would have been. Because cruelty she could have fought against. Cruelty would have confirmed everything she believed, but this kindness from enemies demanded that she question everything. Sarah, the nurse who had wrapped Yuki in a blanket that first day, continued to check on her weekly. It was part of her duties, monitoring the health of prisoners, but she seemed to take a personal interest in Yuki's recovery. She would stop by the sewing detail, exchanging a few words in broken Japanese, sometimes bringing small gifts, a bar of soap, a hair ribbon, once, incredibly, a small mirror. Yuki did not know how to interpret this attention. Was it professional duty? Personal kindness? Pity? She could not ask because her English was too limited and Sarah's Japanese was too basic for complex questions. But the gestures accumulated, creating a strange sort of friendship across enemy lines. One afternoon, Sarah brought a small English lesson book. You learn? She asked hopefully, holding it up. Yuki hesitated. Learning English felt like a betrayal somehow, like accepting that the Americans would be in control for a long time, like giving up hope that Japan would somehow win. But curiosity won out. She nodded. They started simply. Sarah pointing to objects and saying the English words. Needle, thread, fabric, tent, sky, sun. Yuki repeated them, her tongue struggling with the unfamiliar sounds. English was so different from Japanese, harsher, more consonant-heavy, less musical, but gradually it became easier, and with each new word a small barrier fell away. Other prisoners noticed these lessons. Some disapproved, viewing it as collaboration. Others were curious, asking if they could join. Soon a small group gathered in the evenings, attempting to learn basic English from Sarah and a few other American personnel who volunteered their time. It became something to do, something to fill the long evenings, something that felt like moving forward rather than just waiting. There was also Corporal Miller, a young soldier from California who was often assigned to guard the sewing detail. He was barely 20, with red hair and freckles, and he seemed uncomfortable with his role as guard. He did not bark orders or brandish his weapon. He mostly sat in the shade and read letters from home, occasionally looking up to make sure everyone was still there. One day, Yuki's needle broke. She looked up, intending to request a replacement, and caught Miller's eye. He must have seen her distress because he stood and walked over. Problem? He asked. Yuki held up the broken needle, hoping the universal language of broken tools would translate. Miller nodded and walked away. She thought he was leaving, but he returned 5 minutes later with a new needle and a small sewing kit. Here, he said, handing it to her. Keep it. Yuki took the kit, surprised. It was a nice one, military issue, with multiple needles and good thread. Thank you, she managed in English, one of the phrases Sarah had taught her. Miller smiled, a young, genuine smile, and returned to his spot in the shade. These small moments accumulated, a guard sharing his lunch with hungry children, a medic going out of his way to find medicine for an old man's arthritis, Sarah bringing picture books for the young girls in the camp, Miller teaching Kenji, the teenage boy from the cave, how to play baseball with a stick and a wadded-up ball of cloth. None of these were required. None of these were official policy. They were just humans being kind to other humans, even though those other humans were supposed to be enemies. Yuki found these kindnesses harder to bear than hatred would have been. Hatred she could have understood. Hatred she could have returned. But kindness demanded something more difficult. It demanded she recognize the humanity in her captors. And once she recognized their humanity, she had to confront uncomfortable questions about what she had been taught, about what her country had done, about what this war had really been about. 2 months into her captivity, Yuki sat under a tree during the midday rest period, trying to make sense of her life. She had a notebook now. Sarah had given it to her along with a pencil, suggesting she might want to write down her thoughts. Yuki had been hesitant at first, afraid of leaving evidence of dangerous thinking. But gradually she had begun to write, cautiously at first, then with increasing honesty. She wrote, I was taught that Americans were demons, that they valued nothing but money and power, that they treated other races as animals, that they would rape, murder, and torture any Japanese who fell into their hands. Every teacher, every officer, every radio broadcast said the same thing. And I believed it. Why would I not believe it? She paused, chewing on the pencil, then continued, But nothing I was told has been true. The Americans have been... She struggled to find the word. Kind? No, that is not quite right. Professional? Humane? They have treated us according to rules. They have fed us, sheltered us, even educated us. Sarah says it is called the Geneva Convention, Rules for How to Treat Prisoners of War. Japan signed this treaty too, she says, though I do not remember hearing about it before. Another pause. This next part was harder to write. If everything I was told about Americans was a lie, what else was a lie? Was the war necessary? Were we really fighting for our survival or for something else? Were the Americans really the demons, or were they just people? People who happened to be our enemies, but still people? She closed the notebook quickly, afraid someone might read it. These thoughts felt treasonous. In old Japan, before her capture, thinking such things would have been dangerous. People who questioned the war were punished. People who suggested the Americans might not be monsters were branded as traitors. But here, in this prison camp, no one policed her thoughts. No one checked what she wrote. The Americans did not seem to care what she believed as long as she followed the camp rules. That evening, during the English lesson, Sarah brought photographs. Pictures of her home in America, a house with a lawn and flowers, a car in the driveway, her family, parents, siblings smiling at the camera, a small dog. My home, Sarah said in simple English, then repeated it in Japanese. My family, before war. Yuki studied the photographs. The house was large, but not a mansion. Middle class, she guessed, though she had no real framework for understanding American class structures. What struck her was how normal it looked, how ordinary. Sarah was not a demon. She was a woman from a middle-class family who had joined the military as a nurse and been sent to care for wounded soldiers. She had a home, a family, a dog. Just like Yuki had once had a home and a family and a normal life. You have family? Sarah asked, gesturing to Yuki. The question caught Yuki off guard. Did she have family? Her parents were dead. Her aunt lived on the mainland, struggling to survive. That was all. Small family, Yuki managed in English. Parents dead. One aunt. Sarah's face showed genuine sympathy. I'm sorry, she said. War is... She struggled to find a word that worked in both languages. Finally settled on, bad. War is bad. Yuki nodded. Yes, war was bad. This much they could agree on. The realization felt significant somehow. Enemy or not, American or Japanese, they could agree that war was terrible, that it destroyed homes and killed families and left survivors struggling to make sense of the ruins. In that moment, their humanity was more important than their nationality. Not everyone in the camp was experiencing the same transformation Yuki was feeling. The prisoners fell into rough categories based on how they processed their captivity. Some clung fiercely to the old beliefs, insisting that American kindness was a trick, that punishment would come eventually, that any show of friendship was manipulation. These prisoners often isolated themselves, speaking only to each other, refusing to participate in English lessons or accept gifts from guards. Others had swung to the opposite extreme, embracing everything American with an enthusiasm that felt desperate. They learned English eagerly, asked constant questions about America, and seemed to want to erase their Japanese identity and become American instead. Yuki found this transformation unsettling, not because she thought it was wrong exactly, but because it seemed to happen too quickly, too completely, as if these people were replacing one absolute belief system with another rather than actually thinking critically. And then there were people like Yuki and Hana, caught in the middle, wrestling with contradictions, unable to either reject or fully embrace what was happening. They formed a kind of quiet coalition, gathering in the evenings to discuss their confusion in low voices, trying to make sense of a world that no longer followed the rules they had been taught. One evening, Hana raised the question that had been haunting many of them. Why do they treat us this way? What do they gain from feeding us, from being kind? Surely it would be easier to just give us minimal rations and leave us to survive on our own. The question hung in the air. Mrs. Nakamura, who had been listening quietly, spoke up in her elderly, wavering voice. I heard one of the translators explaining it. The Americans believe that all people have rights, even prisoners, even enemies. They say it is part of their philosophy, their way of thinking about what it means to be human. But that makes no sense, another woman protested. We are at war. We killed their soldiers. Why would they care about our rights? Mrs. Nakamura shrugged. I do not claim to understand. I only tell you what I heard. The conversation continued, circling around these central mysteries. Why kindness to enemies? Why follow rules in war? Why treat prisoners as humans rather than as resources or threats? Yuki thought about the Geneva Convention Sarah had mentioned. Rules for war. The concept seemed paradoxical. How could war have rules? War was chaos, destruction, survival at any cost. That was what she had been taught. But the Americans seemed to believe differently. They seemed to believe that even in war, there were lines you did not cross, standards you maintained, ways you had to treat people even if those people were your enemies. Maybe, Hana said slowly, maybe this is what it means to be powerful. Truly powerful. When you are strong enough that you do not fear your enemies, you can afford to be kind to them. Japan was never that strong. We always feared. We always had to be cruel because we were afraid. The observation struck Yuki as profound. Japan had talked constantly about strength, about power, about the superiority of the Japanese spirit, but that talk had always been defensive, always tinged with anxiety about foreign powers, about being invaded, about being weak. The Americans did not seem to have that anxiety. They were so secure in their power that they could follow their own rules even when dealing with defeated enemies. The realization was bitter. Japan had lost not just militarily but philosophically. The Americans had proven that strength did not require cruelty, that power did not require brutality. They had won the war, and now they were winning something deeper. They were demonstrating that their way of thinking about humanity and rights and dignity was more sustainable, more civilized, more fundamentally powerful than anything Japan had offered. 3 months into captivity, the camp administrators organized a work program that allowed prisoners to volunteer for labor outside the camp. The work was simple, helping rebuild roads, clearing rubble from destroyed buildings, assisting with agricultural work on farms that had survived the invasion. Volunteers received extra rations and a small amount of pay that could be used at the camp canteen. Yuki volunteered, partly for the extra food, but mostly because she was desperately curious about the world beyond the camp fences. She wanted to see what Okinawa looked like now, what the Americans were doing to the island, how things were changing. She was assigned to a crew helping to repair a school building in what remained of Naha. The city she had grown up in was unrecognizable. Entire neighborhoods had been erased, reduced to fields of rubble and twisted metal. But amid the destruction, rebuilding had begun. American engineering units worked alongside Okinawan civilians and prisoners, clearing debris, salvaging materials, laying foundations for new structures. What struck Yuki was the organization. The Americans worked from plans, with clear goals and timelines. They did not simply order prisoners to labor, they explained what needed to be done and why. They provided tools and materials, they worked alongside the prisoners rather than simply supervising. There was a sense of collective purpose that Yuki had not expected. They were rebuilding Okinawa. Not as a Japanese territory, certainly, but rebuilding it nonetheless, making it livable again, bringing back some version of civilization. During a lunch break, sitting in the shade of a partially rebuilt wall, Yuki found herself working beside an American soldier. He was young, maybe her age, with dark hair and tired eyes. He offered her a cigarette. She did not smoke, but accepted anyway, not wanting to seem rude. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, then he spoke in slow, clear English. You from here? Okinawa? Yuki nodded. Naha, born here. My family. Gone. She gestured at the ruins around them. The soldier looked uncomfortable. I'm sorry, he said, about all this, about what happened. Nobody wanted... He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Yuki studied him. He looked genuinely distressed, genuinely sorry. Not guilty exactly. He probably had not participated in the bombing of Naha, but regretful that it had been necessary. War bad, Yuki said, using the phrase Sarah had taught her. The soldier laughed, a short, bitter sound. Yeah, war bad. You got that right. They finished their cigarettes in silence, two young people sitting in ruins created by decisions made by people far away, trying to make sense of a world that made no sense. That evening back at the camp, Yuki wrote in her notebook, I am beginning to understand something. The Americans did not come to Okinawa because they hate Japanese people. They came because they are at war with Japan, and Okinawa was necessary for their strategy. The destruction was not personal. The killing was not personal. It was war. Terrible, brutal, necessary war. And now that the fighting is over, they are trying to be humane. They are following their rules. They are treating us as people rather than as enemies because the fighting part is done. She paused, then added, I wonder if Japan would have done the same if the situation were reversed. If Japanese forces had invaded America, would they have fed American prisoners? Would they have treated them according to international rules? Or would they have done what I saw them do to Chinese prisoners in the photographs that circulated before the war? Treat them as less than human? The question disturbed her because she suspected she knew the answer. And the answer made her realize that maybe, just maybe, the Americans were not the monsters in this story. The turning point came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Nothing dramatic, no great event. Just Yuki sitting at the sewing detail working on a torn uniform when she suddenly understood everything with perfect clarity. She was holding the fabric in her hands, American fabric, olive green, rough cotton, military issue. She was repairing it so an American soldier could wear it. She was being paid to do this work. She was fed 3 meals a day. She slept in a dry tent with clean blankets. She was learning English from a nurse who brought her gifts and treated her like a friend. 4 months ago, she had been hiding in a cave, starving, terrified, waiting to die. She had been convinced that capture meant torture and death. She had covered her body in fear when the Americans pulled her from the rubble, certain that violence would follow, and instead Sarah had wrapped a blanket around her and said 2 words, You safe. And it had been true. She was safe. She had been safe for 4 months now. The Americans had not hurt her. They had helped her. They had saved her life. And now they were letting her rebuild it, 1 stitch at a time. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Everything she had been taught was wrong. Not just slightly wrong, not just exaggerated, completely, fundamentally wrong. The Americans were not demons. They were not monsters. They were just people. Flawed people, certainly. People who had bombed her city and killed her parents. People who had brought terrible destruction to Okinawa. But also people who followed rules, who believed in human rights, who tried to treat even their enemies with basic dignity. And if the Americans were not demons, then what did that mean about everything else she had been told? About the war, about Japan's mission, about the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, about all the propaganda that had saturated her entire adult life? If the Americans were not the monsters she had been promised, then maybe Japan was not the hero of the story. Maybe Japan was something else. Maybe Japan was the nation that had started wars of conquest, that had brutalized its neighbors, that had told its people to die rather than surrender because surrender meant horrors that actually turned out to be meals and blankets and kindness. Yuki set down her sewing, hands trembling. The world she had known was gone, not just physically, the caves and the city and her parents, but philosophically. The entire framework through which she understood reality had collapsed. She was not who she thought she was. Japan was not what she thought it was. The enemy was not who she thought they were. Everything was different from what she had believed, and she did not know how to process that. Sarah was making rounds through the sewing detail, checking on workers. When she reached Yuki, she stopped, concerned. You okay? She asked, mixing English and Japanese as always. You look sad. Yuki looked up at her, at this American woman who had shown her more kindness than Yuki had any right to expect. Why? She asked in English, the word rough but clear. Why you kind? Why you help? Sarah seemed to understand the question went deeper than simple curiosity. She sat down on the bench next to Yuki, thinking about her answer. Because, she said slowly in Japanese, you are human, same as me. War is between governments, between nations, not between people. You did not start war. I did not start war. We are just people, and people deserve to be treated like people. That is what I believe. That is what America teaches. All people have worth, even enemies. It was the longest speech Sarah had ever made in Japanese, and parts of it were grammatically awkward, but Yuki understood every word. More than that, she felt them in her bones. All people have worth, even enemies. It was such a simple idea, and it completely contradicted everything she had been taught about hierarchy and superiority and the importance of the collective over the individual. Yuki began to cry. Not quiet tears, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere primal. Sarah put an arm around her shoulders, holding her while she cried, not asking questions, just offering presence and support. Yuki cried for her parents, for her lost city, for the war, for the lies, for the truth, for everything she had been and everything she was becoming. She cried for the girl who had believed in her nation and the woman who no longer knew what to believe. She cried because kindness from an enemy was harder to bear than cruelty would have been, because it demanded recognition, because it made her question everything, because it changed her in ways she could not undo. When she finally stopped, exhausted, Sarah offered her a handkerchief. Yuki took it, wiping her eyes. "Thank you," she said in English, "for blanket, for everything. You saved my life." Sarah smiled, that warm, genuine smile Yuki had come to recognize. "You saved your own life," she said. "You survived. You were strong. I just gave you blanket." But Yuki knew it was more than that. The blanket had been a symbol. It had been the first kindness, the first moment when Yuki's expectations had been proven wrong, the first crack in the wall of propaganda. Everything else had followed from that moment, that instant when an enemy wrapped a blanket around her fear and told her she was safe. In August, news filtered through the camp that something momentous had happened. The announcements were vague at first, but gradually the truth emerged. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. Not just in Okinawa, but everywhere. Completely over. Yuki heard the news and did not know how to feel. Relief? Sadness? Fear? All of these emotions mixed together into something complicated and heavy. The prisoners gathered in small groups, whispering about what this meant. Would they be released? Would they be sent home? Where was home now? Okinawa was destroyed. Japan proper was devastated. Where would they go? What would they find? The uncertainty was terrifying. Strangely, despite being prisoners, the camp had become a kind of stability. 3 meals a day, shelter, safety, medical care. The prospect of leaving that safety for an uncertain future was frightening. Yuki was not alone in this anxiety. Many prisoners whispered at night about their fear of repatriation. "What will we tell our families?" one woman asked. "That we were well fed while they starved? That we learned English and made friends with Americans while Japan burned? How can we explain this?" No one had good answers. The guilt was overwhelming. They had survived captivity better than many Japanese civilians had survived the war itself. How could that be right? How could that be justified? In September, repatriation began. The Americans organized ships to carry Japanese prisoners back to Japan proper. Names were called from lists. People gathered their few belongings, often just the clothes they wore and perhaps a blanket or two, and boarded trucks that would take them to the port. Yuki watched them go with a heavy heart, knowing her turn would come eventually. When Yuki's name was finally called in October, she felt a complex mix of emotions. Part of her wanted to go home, wanted to see her aunt, wanted to be among her own people again. But another part, a part she was ashamed of, did not want to leave. Because leaving meant facing the ruins. Leaving meant confronting what Japan had become. Leaving meant explaining the unexplainable. The night before her departure, Sarah came to say goodbye. She brought gifts, soap, a notebook, some pencils, a small English dictionary. "For you," she said, "to remember, to keep learning." Yuki took the gifts, holding them carefully. "I never forget," she said in English, her pronunciation much improved after 5 months of lessons. "Never forget you. Never forget blanket. Never forget kindness." Sarah smiled, but her eyes were sad. "War is terrible," she said in Japanese. "But people can be good. Remember that. Not all Americans are good. Not all Japanese are bad. Just people. Good people and bad people everywhere." Yuki nodded, understanding the complexity of what Sarah was saying. It was easy to think in categories: American, Japanese, friend, enemy. But reality was more complicated. Individuals mattered, choices mattered, humanity mattered. The ship journey back to Japan was somber. Hundreds of former prisoners crowded below decks, clutching their few possessions, silent or speaking in low voices. Many cried, some prayed, all wondered what they would find. Yuki stood on deck as they approached the Japanese coast, trying to prepare herself for what she might see. But no preparation was adequate for the reality. Hiroshima, where her aunt lived, was gone. Not damaged, gone, erased. A city of hundreds of thousands reduced to almost nothing by a weapon Yuki did not understand, something the Americans called an atomic bomb. The survivors, those who had not fled, lived in makeshift shacks amid the ruins. Disease was rampant. Food was scarce. The devastation was total. Yuki found her aunt in a refugee camp outside the city. Fumiko had aged a decade in the year since Yuki last saw her. Her hair was completely gray, her face was gaunt, she wore rags. When she saw Yuki, she stared for a long moment, then began to cry. They embraced, and Yuki felt her aunt's bones through her thin clothing. "You survived," Fumiko whispered. "You survived." But there was something else in her voice, too. Not quite accusation, but something close. Because Yuki had not just survived, she had thrived comparatively. Her face was full. Her clothes, though simple, were clean and whole. She had shoes. She carried gifts from an American nurse. That night, sharing thin rice porridge in the refugee camp, Fumiko asked the inevitable question. What was it like? Captivity? Yuki did not know how to answer. The truth that she had been fed 3 meals a day, that she had been treated kindly, that she had learned English and made friends with Americans, felt like a betrayal. How could she say these things to her aunt, who had survived bombing and radiation and starvation? It was endurable, Yuki said carefully. The Americans followed rules. Geneva Convention. They fed prisoners, gave medical care. Fumiko absorbed this, nodding slowly. I heard stories, she said. Some said prisoners were treated well. Others said it was propaganda, that secretly they were tortured. I did not know what to believe. She looked at Yuki searchingly. Were you treated well? Yuki hesitated, then nodded. Yes, very well. Better than... She could not finish the sentence. Better than you were treated by your own government. Better than Japanese civilians were treated during the war. But she did not have to finish. Fumiko understood. Then you were fortunate, Fumiko said simply. I am glad you survived. Nothing else matters. But Yuki knew it did matter. Everything mattered. The way the war had been fought, the lies they had been told, the kindness she had received from enemies while her own people suffered, all of it mattered. All of it had to be reckoned with. Years passed. Japan rebuilt, slowly transforming from ruins into a modern nation. The American occupation brought changes, democracy, women's rights, new laws, new ways of thinking. Some resisted these changes, others embraced them. Yuki found herself somewhere in the middle, trying to preserve what was valuable from Japanese tradition while also acknowledging that the old ways had led to disaster. She married in 1950 a merchant who had also survived the war. Together they opened a small shop, not kimonos this time, but Western-style clothing. The skills she had kept alive during her captivity, sewing uniforms for Americans, now served her well in peacetime. She prospered modestly, enough to support herself and her aunt and eventually her own children. But she never forgot. The blanket, that first blanket Sarah had wrapped around her, she kept it folded in a chest for decades. Sometimes she would take it out and hold it, remembering. The weight of the wool, the smell of it, the moment when her expectations of cruelty met the reality of mercy. That moment had changed everything. It had broken the wall of propaganda and forced her to see Americans as people. And in seeing them as people, she had to reconsider everything she thought she knew about the war, about Japan, about right and wrong. When her daughter was old enough to ask about the war, Yuki told her a carefully edited version. She explained that she had been captured and held in a prisoner camp, that the Americans had treated her according to international law, that she had been frightened at first, but later realized she was safe. She did not tell her daughter about the blanket, not then. That story was too personal, too fraught with complicated emotions. But when her daughter grew older, when she was a university student studying history and asking harder questions about what the war had meant, Yuki finally showed her the blanket. An American nurse gave this to me, she said, when I was more frightened than I have ever been in my life. I expected to be hurt. Instead, she covered my fear with this blanket and told me I was safe. And she was right. I was safe. That act of simple kindness from an enemy changed my entire understanding of the world. Her daughter touched the old wool, now worn thin in places. Why did they do it? She asked. Why be kind to prisoners when they could have been cruel? Yuki smiled. Because that is what it means to be truly strong. Cruelty is easy. It requires no thought, no restraint, no moral courage. But kindness to enemies? That is hard. That requires you to see them as human, even when they are trying to kill you. That requires rules and discipline and a belief that all people have basic rights. The Americans had that strength. We did not. And that is why they won. It was a bitter truth, but an important one. Japan had been strong in some ways, disciplined, determined, willing to sacrifice, but it had been weak in the most important way. It had failed to see the humanity in others. It had treated Chinese, Koreans, Filipinos, and its own people as resources to be expended rather than as humans with inherent worth. The Americans, for all their flaws, had understood something deeper about power and strength and human dignity. And so the blanket became more than just a piece of wool. It became a symbol of the moment when everything Yuki believed was proven wrong. When the enemy she feared turned out to be the people who saved her life. When cruelty gave way to kindness and hatred gave way to humanity. That blanket wrapped around her shaking shoulders by an American nurse named Sarah was proof that even in war, especially in war, mercy matters. That how we treat our enemies says more about us than how we treat our friends. For Yuki and thousands of other Japanese prisoners, the kindness they received in American camps was harder to bear than cruelty would have been. Because cruelty would have confirmed what they believed. Kindness forced them to question everything. It demanded they recognize the humanity in their enemies. And once they recognized that humanity, they could not go back to the simple certainties of propaganda. They had to live with complexity, with ambiguity, with the uncomfortable truth that the world was not divided neatly into good people and bad people, but was instead full of individuals making choices, some good, some bad, all human. As Yuki told her granddaughter many years later, near the end of her long life, "When I was young, I thought strength meant being willing to die for your beliefs. But I learned that true strength means being willing to question your beliefs, to change your mind when faced with evidence, to recognize humanity in those you were taught to hate. The blanket Sarah gave me was warm, yes, but what it really gave me was the freedom to think differently, and that gift was worth more than all the wool in the world." Stories like Yuki's remind us that even in humanity's darkest hours, there is room for mercy, that even enemies can show unexpected kindness, that how we treat others, especially others who are powerless, who are afraid, who are at our mercy, defines who we are more than any victory or defeat. If this story moved you, if it made you think about how we treat those we consider enemies, then please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. These forgotten stories from history matter. They show us that kindness is not weakness, that mercy is not naive, that treating people with dignity even in the worst circumstances is possible. And in a world that still has too much conflict, too much hatred, too much division, these lessons from the past are more important than ever. Thank you for listening to Yuki's story. And remember, sometimes a blanket is just a blanket, but sometimes it's the thing that changes everything.